Well, hello. Thanks for your time and attention. I know there's probably a lot going on. It's an interesting time to be alive, to say the least, and I'm sure you have as much pandemic fatigue as I do, but come with me. We'll have an interesting conversation, hopefully, at the end of this, and maybe you'll learn some new things. Maybe you won't, but we'll at least have something to talk. So with that, I'll introduce myself a bit and tell a bit of my story. The first portion, maybe even half of this, will be a little bit about who I am and how I got here and why I think some of the things I think. And then the last half will be all those things that I think and some of these lessons that I learned. And this is just a couple like logos to kind of frame some of the journey I've had. But people know me from this DevOps narrative, going back to kind of the beginning of DevOps. I was a co-founder of Puppet. I was VP of engineering on an OpenStack startup that was eventually sold to EMC. I spent 5 years at Pivotal and then got more and more focused from the Cloud Foundry ecosystem into the Kubernetes ecosystem. And then I came to Red Hat about 2 years ago. In parallel to that, I was part of building the DevOps community. I was also part of this community I think was seminal for some of this, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Velocity conference from O'Reilly. I wrote some of these books for O'Reilly and just kind of like been in this ecosystem at the nexus of agile, cloud computing, open source, like working on a bunch of interesting projects and products. This next slide is to show you my peak pandemic beard, because I want you to have a full appreciation for my various configurations of hair and beard. And this is also a critical slide because it has my Twitter handle and my personal logo that I made. I like to make logos, which you're going to see a few more by the end of this. If you want to get a hold of me, have these conversations publicly on Twitter or privately on LinkedIn, be my guest. So as I said, I come in various configurations of hair and beard. These are some pictures from different configurations over the last few years. If you see me in a different configuration, don't be afraid. I'm still the same monster. So I also, like, some of the stuff I'm going to present today is really the work of my brain trust that I brought with me to Red Hat. And we do interesting work together there, but we also had interesting work before we got there. So just for the sake of completeness, my team at Red Hat right now is 𝒕𝒉𝒊𝒔, who wrote the Phoenix project and 𝒍𝒊𝒄𝒌, has a bunch of interesting perspectives on a lot of the things we're going to talk about. Then you have John Willis, who is the author of the DevOps Handbook. He only sold 1 million copies. Kevin sold 6 million. So we're trying to help John out. He also wrote Beyond the Phoenix Project with Gene Kim. And then last but not least, and some of the ideas I'll share today are really coming from Jabe's brain. Jabe is a PhD at Carnegie Mellon who is focused on organizational dynamics and how the organizational behaviors adapt to take advantage or are influenced to adapt from the change in technology. So there's kind of like fascinating things that come out of the conversations with this group, as you can imagine. We wrote some of these books. We did some of this work. A lot of times people say things like thought leader or like frame some of this stuff as thought leadery. And I guess I keep getting invited to say words. So there's some of that, but I like to think of myself as a work leader. And to me, there's lots of things you could say, but until you can kind of put the work together and have the scars and get the real mud and blood from that, it's not the same. So there's lots of thoughts, but there's also got to be work. This is a very privileged career that I've had, and I feel like what I get to do now is just a continuation of that. So at the nexus of all these open source projects and watching the practices that are emerging around using those open source projects to build the cloud, to build hybrid infrastructures and deliver applications across a bunch of different communities, across a bunch of different organizations. There's lots of things that we work with that are enterprise. There's also, you can see these patterns emerge in startups and then kind of move into enterprise. And I feel like there's at least for me, I'm never bored, just like watching that practice evolve and being able to be part of it. So this is, again, more of my story, kind of before any of this stuff with Puppet and configuration management and making those systems happen. I was a software developer. So way back in the day, Java certified, whatever, Sun certified Java programmer, got into some startups just by chance. First job out of grad school, I joined a startup, and they were trying to do Scrum. And I'd come from this background where we made lots of software in grad school, and I felt like a lot of the things that they were doing were just, for lack of a better word, really brain damaged. And the thing that drove me the craziest about the way they were trying to do this was that you weren't supposed to question it. Like there's a response to certain things that would happen, and I would say, well, why don't we do this other thing that might work? And they'd be like, that's not what Agile people do. I'd be like, okay. And there's other talks where I went into deeper versions of this, and then there's the talks over drinks and dinner where I go even deeper. But I kind of came into this thing where I'd made a bunch of software, came into people trying to do Agile, and didn't really appreciate what Agile had to offer. But then I got lucky, and this is early in my career, so very early in 2000s. I stumbled into this group, which was there's an ongoing renaissance around tech and process, and I feel like I've become part of that narrative on some level. But I met with this guy Alistair Coburn, and I happen to live in Salt Lake City, and there's this Salt Lake City Agile Roundtable, and I started going to the Agile Roundtable to get a better understanding of the vocabulary and what Agile actually meant to have, for all intents and purposes, ammunition at work. So then, as I got there and started like realizing the richness of some of these ideas that are more fundamentally sound, in my opinion, than kind of like the superficial approaches that emerged, where you get someone who's quote unquote a master after a 2-day certification if they could keep their heart beating for 2 days, versus people who are really doing a lot of interesting work delivering software. And those conversations and like the living laboratory, essentially, that Alistair was able to bring together on a monthly basis for a good almost 10 years. We had the Agile Roundtable, and I had this kind of pattern matching opportunity across startups and enterprise while I was working as a software developer, to just see everyone come to Alistair and have like some interesting problem they were trying to solve with the context of their organization. And the group would come up with some experiments, and they would go back into their organizations and they'd run those experiments and come back. So I was just soaking in this fountain of kind of like Agile conversation, from Alistair. And if you're not familiar with the whole narrative here, Alistair was a signatory to the Agile Manifesto, and really the primary reason why the manifesto was signed in Utah. And then he was kind enough to invite me, along with some of the other signatories and some other people, to the 10-year anniversary of the signing at Snowbird. So that was also, a highlight of some of my Agile stuff. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some Agile things in a minute, or like Agile conferencing things. So I invented DevOps. Sometimes people introduce me like this, and it's that's not how I think about this, and actually think it's super embarrassing when people say things like that I invented it, or frankly that anyone invented it. And I'll explain a bit more of what I mean from that. So I think it's embarrassing, like I said, because I didn't invent DevOps. In fact, I stole it, and I stole it from my friends. So here we are. So this is advice. If you get anything from this talk, take this advice. Good DevOps copy, great DevOps deal. We can have arguments about whether DevOps is a role or method or whatever, like later, but this is just a funny way to give you the permission to take lessons from wherever you find them and try to apply them to your own context. So this is a story about the Velocity Conference. So there's Velocity Conference in 2009. This is in Santa Clara, and I gave a talk in the same conference that was called Agile Infrastructure. I gave 2 talks that year that you can watch. You can see the slides from the Agile Infrastructure Talk at Velocity, which is essentially me trying to explain Agile to this operations community. And then you can see the Agile Infrastructure Talk, which is fully recorded on InfoQ, called Agile Infrastructure, it was Agile 2009 in Chicago, which is me and my friend at the time co-presenting what we call the Agile Infrastructure, which was sort of the opposite talk, which was us explaining. So it was a thought worker and myself at Puppet explaining to the Agile community how operations work. So one Agile Infrastructure Talk is Agile for operations. The other one is operations for Agile. And those are both interesting, kind of like from a historic perspective around DevOps. So this is the same conference I gave that talk. And this is the 10 deploys per day from John Alspaugh and Paul Hammond. This is a pretty famous talk in a lot of ways. And it's kind of like the first time people were talking about this frequency of deployment, right? Continuous delivery is kind of like about to be published. And there's a bunch of these other ideas that are floating around that people are converging on. But this is a talk, and you can watch this talk. This one got recorded. And this is just kind of representative. And I was sitting in the audience and I was tweeting these kind of things, as one does at a conference. So don't just say, no, you aren't respecting other people's problems, tag, and just out of my, whatever, looking at the title of the talk, I was like, I'll tag this DevOps, why not? And that's kind of like the first historical use of this term in this context. And there's a bunch of these other things. And at the same time, my friend, who I had met, Patrick, at an Agile conference, which I think I put on a slide in a second. We met in Toronto in 2008. He had already been writing about how to leverage Agile planning and kind of like Agile approaches to system administration. And we were co-conspiring on a format and a time for what we were at the time kind of calling Agile Infrastructure Conference to bring together developers and operators. And he saw the tweet stream and he's like, we're going to call it DevOps Days. And that was the deal. So that was born 2009. But there's like some historical context. And this is why people say things like, invented DevOps or whatever. But this is from 2006. And I think this is very interesting. And it's often quoted, at least the kind of you build it, you run it. I'll read it for the sake of completeness. The traditional model is that you take your software to the wall that separates development and operations and throw it over and then forget about it. Not at Amazon. You build it, you run it. This brings developers into contact with the day-to-day operation of their software. It also brings them into day-to-day contact with the customer. This customer feedback loop is essential for improving the quality of the service. So this is 2006, 3 years before DevOps is a word. Werner Vogels, as a CTO of Amazon, describing things that sound suspiciously like what I would consider DevOps. And there's more to that story. This is 2007. This is, at the time, another person that was working at Amazon when this was written. So Jesse Robbins, who's another one of my friends who was a co-founder of Chef in 2007 while he was at Amazon. And he's also the founder of the Velocity Conference. So this is all we weave together. He wrote this blog post, which you can still read, about operations as the secret sauce. And I'm going to make this point over and over that lots of what people consider kind of like problems with their software is really about improving operations and getting operational excellence. So traditional operations has all of this toil. That's what the colors on the graph represent, is the amount of work, the amount of hours that humans do doing tasks as the systems scale. And the core argument here is that this new secret sauce way of doing operations, so this is kind of the golden age of Puppet and some of these tools, the new secret sauce way of doing this is driving down the human toil to deliver the reliability, right? So 2007, this is 2008. These are the slides I used to do. Wall of confusion, which is essentially an argument. I'm going to come back to this argument a little bit later as well. Between kind of like the developer and operator roles in organizations and how they communicate or don't communicate between each other. And so like the core argument here, or the core thread, is like we don't really see each other as human, and it leads to unhappiness or mischief because we're kind of forced to communicate through these ticket systems and don't humanize the work on either side. this book, 2009, had me, had Patrick, had John Allspaw, and Jesse Robbins all contributed to this book. Like I said, it was a renaissance on several dimensions, and I think that's just continued till now. Wrote this book before DevOps the Word, published, and these are, again, I'm going to come back to this force, and this is kind of like one of the core conflicts between stabilization or destabilizing. Later, I'm going to call it the conflict between innovation and efficiency. But this is this timeless struggle. And so just for the sake of having something silly to say, there's a picture of me and Patrick, and everything before 2006, we're going to call BC, before cloud. And then, because that's the year Amazon launched EC2. And then everything after 2009, we're going to call AD, after DevOps. So Patrick and I met at an Agile conference. I was soaking in Agile, and really a lot of the DevOps conversations that I had in this Agile infrastructure was about, like, to me, Agile is really sort of two big buckets. One is about the planning and the process of kind of like planning and kind of keeping the flow of value. And then the other bucket, and these two communities don't always intersect or interact as well as I'd hope, is really about like the technical engineering sides of Agile. So the TDD and continuous integration, and lots of what I was trying to do with what became, so these DevOps conversations was extend the Agile planning practices and the Agile engineering practices into like this operational context where you could start to configure systems with an API, you could start to monitor systems, deploy whatever with APIs, and so that looks suspiciously like software development. At the same time, I was really sick of having all these kind of problems with, the configuration drift between my development environments, my testing environments, and my production environments. And so lots of the energy was about, bringing like a testing mentality to configuration and being able to rebuild all of these things from source. None of the Agile engineering practices are possible until you can reliably rebuild your applications from source, to do your CI. And so I was just extending that same idea to my infrastructure, and I wanted to be able to reproduce all of my infrastructure from code across all these environments to kind of keep them in lockstep with the life cycle for the software. So there's like an Agile thing running through all this. So this is not like a different thing. Like sometimes people have, their own kind of weird organizational interpretation of stuff. It's like Agile, some different thing than DevOps. DevOps was really an extension of Agile to running software, right? Because when Agile Manifesto was signed in 2001, most of what we consider kind of software in that time was not really on the internet yet. Like there was the internet for sure, but the preponderance of software when the Agile Manifesto was written is shrink wrap software that shipped on physical media. And so the practices have to change as you get to running software, or you have this massive impedance mismatch between the production and the building of the software and actually running it. So lots of organizations develop this, we have Agile till the release, but then we put it on our servers in this big batch, right? And so, continuous delivery, whatever threads you want to kind of weave into this narrative is about extending that to the deployment and the ongoing operations of the software. And it wasn't something someone sat down and thought out. Like no one's like, oh, we just need a DevOps now and this is going to be solved. It was the pressure to deliver the systems and the experimentation that was happening across all these different organizations that led to the practices. And this is that transition from software on shrink wrap to software as a service. And then the pressure is increasing constantly because you're trying to run these services at scale and you're trying to run them reliably. And you're trying to never stop running features. Like you never stop adding and changing the software, right? And so there's all these things that are kind of at odds with each other because nothing causes outages like change, and you're constantly changing it because you want to add more features. So just to be fully buzzword compliant, up to date, this is what people are trying to do, right? And so, I have other talks where I kind of think through and like walk through where, if you're talking about continuous delivery, what it's about is adding more deployments in time. And then when you're doing microservices, it's about adding more deployments in space. So if you're going to continuously deliver microservices and you haven't driven the fixed cost of deploying and testing your software down to near zero, then every deployment is expensive, and the accumulation of more deployments in time and more deployments in space is going to be even more expensive. So there you go. So this is me on another stage back when we could leave the house and do all those things, giving kind of like my definition of DevOps. And again, like I think people get a little too wrapped around the axle on if we just had a better definition and like all these things would be better. But this is a definition that I'm fond of. And it's really just extending this idea that software is eating the world, that software is optimizing all these experiences and all these performances for us. Like software is best, in my opinion, when it's for us as humans. And so DevOps is about optimizing that human experience and performance of operating the software with software and with humans. And I'm going to come back to this theme as well, which is this kind of notion of a socio-technical system. And there's sort of this pendulum that swings in conversation in organizations between, super high focus on the tools and the tech, and then like super high focus on the humans and the soft side. And really the argument I try to get people to understand is like there's one system. This is a socio-technical system that's delivering the results. So the data's in. We won't spend too much time on this, but this is an interesting State of DevOps report. It's unclear exactly where it will go because they're sort of born a puppet a long time ago. It was like 10 years ago. This is the one from, I think, 2019. And then it evolved, and then Dora was kind of like doing it, and it was awesome. And then Dora got bought by Google, and then at some point now there's like 5 different ones. But they're interesting. This is the Dora one from 2019, I believe. That there's a screenshot, and now I'm unclear because Nicole left Google, and we'll see where it goes. But I think it's interesting for a variety of reasons. But that data is there showing that the high performing organizations are deploying more frequently, but they're also deploying with less failure rates. And when they do fail, they can recover faster. So more frequently, you do it. Yeah, like all of it's good if you can like get to that level, right? So this is this tension between the old way and the new way. And then now I'm getting into a lot of the stuff where I'm going to start talking about the way this abstract was written and the way I talk a lot of the times during the day, which is like less focus on agility and more about this like core conflict and kind of like these different competencies, which you're going to see in a minute. So there's the old way and all of these things, and this is sort of an infrastructure-centric way to frame it. And then the new way, there's also old ways and new ways for software development, which in some ways I feel like the agile software, like that happened before the change to the new ways for infrastructure, right? So the Agile manifesto is sort of like that demarcation. So everyone wants transformation, right? Like marketing ruins everything, right? So everyone's trying to sell you digital transformation. And when you get deeper into the conversation, it's not actually what most organizations want. And I'll explain why, but what they really want, what you might really want is a bunch of other things. So we'll say agility, we'll say scalability, availability, reliability, operability, more abilities, usability, observability. Why not throw profitability? You want it all for free. Maybe not you, but someone you know. And then without changing anything, right? Like that's the big punchline. So just to make that point, I like to make the text really, really big. So let that burn in your mind for a moment without changing anything. And I'm sure some of you trying to help people adopt Agile or DevOps or whatever the word is, if it requires changing behavior, there's some resistance to that. And this is a quick aside in some ways, but this is this thing that helped me make peace with some of this. So I got very frustrated. I used to help try to get people to adopt Agile practices. Then as I got more and more into DevOps community and that work, trying to adopt DevOps, a lot of time right now I'm working on, which is similar to DevOps or kind of like a subroot of DevOps, which I'm very fond of, is like the SRE practices, which is a very kind of specific way of framing some of this. And what I got really frustrated with early in my career is this pattern where people will adopt the language, right? Like the language of Agile crossed the chasm a long time ago, but the practices of Agile DevOps or whatever didn't really cross the chasm in some cases. And so the thing, and this is supported by research about how, you know, organizations and cultures adopt technology, that what you see in practice is the early adopters and the innovators are motivated to get an advantage. Their game they're trying to win is something that is forcing them to seek an advantage. And then what happens is you get things like the State of DevOps report, and it demonstrates the actual advantage. And that advantage that's demonstrable legitimizes the practice. And so you transition into this mode where, you know, and maybe this is not quite true at the lip of the early majority, but definitely by you get to the mid majority, it's true that you're no longer seeking advantage, you're seeking legitimacy. And that's this kind of phenomenon I described a minute ago, where you start to see organizations who they want to use the language, they want to use the, you know, they want to be legitimate because that's what legitimate people are doing, but they don't really do the deep work to change the behaviors to drive those actual outcomes that will give them an advantage. So this is a problem. I think it's a problem. And it used to be very frustrating to me, but we got past it. So this is hard, and this is especially hard in the framing where you're talking about dev and ops, right? And I'd also argue, and I'm going to argue hopefully more clearly in a moment, that it's more than just dev and ops. Like there's all these other roles that take, and you know, the focus of what I'm going to share today is really about software delivery and software operations. But there's even bigger issues as you get to like the disconnects between sales and engineering, and sales and marketing engineering, like whatever. Like there's all these kind of things, and the reason you can't change alone is because everything's connected as a social technical system. And as you move into these processes with these tools, with like the cloud native kind of capabilities, it's not about, oh, the developers are doing this different, and then, oh yeah, here's a tool for the operators and they could do their thing different. Like you have to simultaneously change multiple personas across the organization to get out of those kind of like impedance mismatches at the boundaries between the roles. So you have to change more than one thing simultaneously, and that makes it even harder. So lots of data, lots of information out in the analyst world about what digital transformation is and what people do. And you know, I don't necessarily want to debate this today, but this is kind of in the middle, right? So if you go look at the research, you go look at the analysts, there's every number from the lowest I've ever seen is about 60%, and the highest I've seen is mid-90s. So the analysts agree that most of these investments are failures, or they don't live up to their criteria for success. So there's like some nuance there about how they define it. But the kind of overarching theme from my reading of this research is that organizations make these investments, but they don't get good results because they aren't really prepared to change, right? And we kind of like walk through a bit of why that happens. So my distillation of the last decade, and also working with my co-conspirators I mentioned earlier, is we kind of distilled it into what I call the 5 failures, or the 5 elements. And we'll start with them as failures, and then we'll kind of like reframe the new way of thinking about it. So there's what I call leadership failure, which is that leadership actively prevents the new ways of working. There's a product failure, which is you want to work in new ways and maybe even got sponsorship to do that, but you don't have a strategic connection to the digital investments you're making and the digital experience you're creating to the core kind of value proposition of the organization. And you see lots of investments in, you know, a mobile app for this, or like some vanity thing for that doesn't really drive meaningful value. And I've literally watched hundreds of millions of dollars get plowed into projects that were probably a bad idea. And anyone who is willing to like analyze it for 2 seconds would have realized that. But that, like, for whatever reason, organizations get on this track to deliver the Gantt chart 3 years from now, even if they're doing an agile practice, like their roadmap is not necessarily adjusting to the reality of their situation. Then there's the development failure. This is like the center of the agile practices, really, right? So this is about that core competency in communication and technical capabilities, that gives you the ability to take requirements and deliver the features, right? That's like pretty well explained and understood by this community, hopefully. Then I think this is key. And I've seen a lot of failures on what I'll call the architectural failures. And it's sort of sad to me that architecture got set up as such a straw man in some of the early agile conversations. But when you get to certain scales and certain levels of complexity, it behooves you to understand the promises that your architecture can keep with respect to things like latency, scalability, reliability, like a bunch of those other ilities are really predicated on having architectures that can keep those promises. And then last but not least, and related to that, and near and dear to my heart, is operational excellence. So the failure here is that you have lots of incidents and outages, and there's a number of reasons why that happens in terms of the process, in terms of the investment. But I'll argue that this is the defining advantage of the true cloud native, of the true cloud capable companies, is that operational excellence that comes from being able to keep those reliable systems, right? And so then we'll just, again, like I can't do these full justice on each one, like they almost deserve their own talk, but there's new ways of framing leadership. This is related to agile conversations, it's related to DevOps conversations, but getting leaders that aren't command and control, that are inspiring, sponsoring, clarifying, and then last but not least, what I think I see a lot of organizations who have a culture of avoidance and let conflict sort of fester. And there's lots of, like I said, this deserves its own hour, but real leadership is about bringing the conflicts to the surface and reconciling them in favor of these collective interests. Then you have this product model, and there's lots of interesting stuff. Some of my favorite thought thinkers here is like Melissa Perry, Jeff Patton. There's like lots of interesting stuff emerging around product, but being able to have some kind of mental and maybe even mathematical model of what you're trying to do that you can measure and validate your hypothesis. That's key to me in the new kind of ways of thinking about delivering product. And then communication is core. So even if you have kind of come up with the model and you think it's validated, it's core that it's communicated down into the rest of the organization through those capabilities to drive those outcomes. Then you have development. We'll skip this. It's like basically agile stuff. Architecture. It's about being able to keep those promises, but it's also about being able to get reusability and arrangement and extension across the organization. And then last but not least, operations, collaboration, automation, metric sharing. This is like the DevOps conversation. So what I try to help people think about is investing in these things and reframing them as opportunities, right? So that you have executive sponsorship for really changing, that you have some mental model for how you're going to create value that is driving strategic requirements, that you have the ability to deliver those features. Given that you now have these great requirements, can you actually deliver them with high fidelity, on some timely fashion? And then architecture is about, and I'm going to share a little bit of what I think this looks like, about making some of this stuff right through these shared platforms. And then you want to build systems that never stop. And that's a socio-technical system that never stops, not necessarily just the computer side. So many organizations, or most organizations, have these roles, right? You have developers, you have architects, blah, blah, blah. I will argue a lot of organizations, many organizations, too many organizations, do not have these capabilities. So then I'm going to go into like a slightly different framing, which I promised I would earlier, and kind of come back and combine these at the end. So there's this traditional IT, and this is literally talks like I gave in the Agile infrastructure talks I mentioned earlier. Wall of confusion came from 2008. So traditional IT, you put this wall of confusion between these two roles, you communicate through the ticket system, makes people unhappy or mischievous, right? So we got to that. But what I came to appreciate, and I'm going to share some of Jabe's thoughts in language in a minute, is the two sides are really trying to win two different games, right? They're playing two different games, and they don't necessarily understand that they're connected. So this is Jabe's related to Jabe's PhD work, and it's this kind of notion of the tension between innovation and efficiency, right? And it's not even about technology. It's just like if you're trying to optimize a process for efficiency, you can't simultaneously always optimize it for innovation. right? And that plays out in manufacturing, that plays out in all these other things, and scaling up as you go. So there's this framing, which I revisited DevOps conversations through this lens of the tension between innovation and efficiency. And then what I really love is going to come out in this. So oversimplification is that you have these two sides of an organization. One is sort of incentivized to create more value. The other incentivized to drive down costs, create efficiencies, standards. And it plays out at that individual level. It also plays out at the organizational level, right? So you see this manifest in these sort of business units that are at odds with IT operations. Leadership can be the problem as well. But one side's trying to go fast, trying to get new customers, more new markets, do these things differently and innovatively. And then you have IT operations who has a tendency to be wanting to control and get these like really repeatable efficiencies. And that creates this tension. So again, I say I like to make logos. We made logos for these as well. So you have like this notion of the differentiation economy where the game is won by creating novelty. The game is about experimenting, failing fast, getting that feedback so you can drive towards the innovative outcome with and for your customers, or whatever your mission is. And then the scale economy is that opposite side. So this is like kind of like the ops side of it, where you're trying to build that reliability, reduce the variation, and consolidate the resources. So those two games, those two economies are setting us against each other. And the wall is because we don't understand the other game or that they're connected. So what if we could win both those games together? And this is kind of like this emergence, and this is starting super abstract and academic, because it's from Jabe's academic brain. And hopefully it get more concrete as we go. So we can play a new game. And this is what Jabe in his research, and it's also like he got this language from prior art, is what he calls the scope economy. And so the scope is this connecting, emerging like technical thing and social thing that allows us to keep promises on both sides. So this is this thing that we win this game by getting more reuse and sharing across the organization. So we negotiate this shared value and bring it into the scope economy. Again, super abstract, but hopefully it'll be more concrete in a moment, that this game is won by the scope economy balancing the need for the differentiation economy and the scale economy, enabling both innovation and efficiency. And this economy, the scope economy, and this I think is honestly like such a beautiful idea. And I really revisited every DevOps conversation through this idea for the last decade, which is the ongoing negotiation between selfish interests in favor of the collective, right? So a lot of times people get, way on one end, focus on tools, or on their end, like saying culture. Like, to what extent as an organization, as a practice, are you able to bring the selfish interests involved, whether that's dev and ops or any of these other roles, and negotiate those selfish interests in favor of the organizational collective? So again, I'm going to make it more and more concrete as we go. So there's some things that are beginning as innovations, like the teams are building their own pipelines, they're building, they're making all these choices about their tools. That has the potential to create a lot of operational burden downstream. And it might be more valuable for the organization to make some of those architectural decisions in a collective way that enables that team to unlock their velocity, to unlock their features, but also doesn't have that sprawling set of tools across every single team being different. And then the other side of this is that you often have resources that are overly restricted, right? So if these things get out of balance and one side's kind of like dominant, then if the differentiation economy is dominant, you're creating all this downstream burden, technical debt. If the scale economy is dominant, then it's slowing innovation because no one has access to these resources. And so recognizing that some of these resources might be overly restrictive relative to their value and the risk, it's valuable as an organization to move those into the shared thing. And so this is also related to the time when some of these processes got set up in organizations, an IT decision was hundreds of thousands of dollars, where now when you're talking about containers, or you're talking about pennies, and the overhead and the restrictive process to access them is often out of balance and maybe more expensive than the resource that's managed. So that's a thing. We're going to get even more concrete. So here's some inspiring examples, hopefully, or I think they're inspiring. They're my friends. Whoops, that's a reveal. So these are not my words. That's supposed to be a build, but we'll just go with it. So I'll read it anyway. So remove friction from product development, high trust, low process, no handoff between teams. Don't do your own undifferentiated heavy lifting. Use simple patterns automated by tooling. Self-service cloud makes impossible things instant. This is from a talk that my friend did in 2014, right after he left Netflix and went to the VC, but before he went to Amazon. Adrian is a talk you can watch from 2014. But if you read between the lines of everything he's describing this scope of economy that allows the developers to have all these abilities to provision infrastructure and do deployments, but also allows the operations to keep those reliability requirements and promises that we all kind of take for granted watching Netflix. So I'm going to assert that Netflix, Amazon, Google, every cloud native company built these shared platforms because they had to. That they're winning pressure to deliver these systems. They're all sort of like in different shapes and sizes and purpose built maybe for that particular organization. But you see these common patterns emerge in all of them around self-service access and kind of like all these resources things. This is straight from the SRE book. I'll read it. SRE builds framework modules to implement canonical solutions for the concerned production area. As a result, development teams can focus on the business logic because the framework already takes care of correct infrastructure use. So here you see this. Google is describing and explaining how they build their shared platform straight from the SRE book. The Borg, if you're familiar with that, that's the container scheduler thing that was built inside of Google, is really this scope economy construct that allows that. Kubernetes is a scope economy construct that's inspired by Borg as an open source project. If you're not familiar with Kubernetes, you probably should be. And this is just like mind blowing to me. But Kubernetes is an open source global commons to build these local shared platform commons. So that's kind of interesting to study. And then if you're into SRE or kind of like study SLOs as a subset of SRE practices, this is straight from the SRE book again. But the SLO is essentially a commenting exercise that selfish interest in favor of the collective negotiated between the SRE and the software engineers at Google. So you have 3 games and you're trying to win them. You win the differentiation game by creating more novelty, more new things. You win the scope game by creating more sharing. You win the efficiency game you win the scale game by creating more efficiency. So the holy grail is getting to where you have, and like almost every DevOps project before, we call it DevOps, was about trying to build these platforms that allowed this to happen. I think it was harder with that old paradigm than it is with the container paradigm, but you want to get to where you have self-service access that's facilitated by this kind of enabling constraints, right? So the constraints are keeping promises to both sides. They allow the developers to do whatever they can or whatever they need to create that value while keeping all those strong promises to operations and the reliable underlying infrastructure. So coming to the end, this is just another quick shout out to a Carnegie Mellon PhD who currently works at Microsoft, but I just think it's a great quote from his research. Platforms may be understood more conceptually as a guiding principle that redefine 2 sides of a binary relationship that reveal the middle mass as an opportunity for intervention. Platforms can help us recommon resources, resource management through new approaches to negotiation. So he's not even talking about platforms in the sense I just did. He's actually talking about, and you can look at his research about how common things are in a housing thing, or in like the whole model is based on these African tribal constructs. So I love his research and I love this language, but really what I borrowed from him and Jay borrowed from him is this notion of recommoning and bringing those selfish interests into that mass middle. And so that's another great takeaway is like, how can you bring those selfish interests into that negotiation? So traditional IT sets up the wall of confusion. We recommend these things. So there's like a common pattern where I consider an action pattern where the ops side decides we're going to build this platform. They build it and no one comes, right? Because it's not, there's no agency contributing. There's none of the kind of like selfish interests of the developers represented, right? So finding that balance where everyone's contributing as an agent to the things that are the best for the collective outcome. And we get to this, what we call platform as the interface between these interests. They're going to be able to keep strong promises. There's a whole nother talk track about automated governance. And if you work in a highly regulated industry, at some point you start to bottleneck all these investments on automation, on the governance, risk, and compliance. And so like there's a whole nother hour we could spend talking about ways to kind of address that and move through that and try to get to where you're bringing the same level of automation to a lot of the compliance and auditing work. So last but not least, we're on the home stretch. I like to quote people. So this is a Sun Tzu quote: "All can see these tactics whereby I conquer, but what none can see is the strategy out of which victory is evolved." And so the idea here is like strategy is one thing. Tactics are easy to see. Strategy is harder to see. And so this is like a kind of thought leadery representation of some of the ideas all put together. So you have the scale and differentiation economy on the horizontal axis here. You have the strategic and tactical on the vertical axis. So the most tactical thing that happens in an organization is really operations, right? So that's this manifestation of the scale economy on a minute by minute, moment by moment, hour by hour basis to keep those systems reliable, right? And that if you don't respond, like you're literally done. Like there's no software running. And then you have the tactical manifestation of differentiation is the developers who are doing things that are, definitely hour by hour, day by day, contributing to these meaningful outcomes of innovation. Then you have what I'll call the strategic manifestation of the scale economy is architecture. It's like the long arc of the investments that we're making to get those efficiencies. And then product is that strategic manifestation of the innovation economy. And then leadership is sort of like, imagine that coming out of the screen. The more leadership you have, the stronger capabilities you can have with each and keep them all in balance. Because, there's a deeper conversation we could have about the pathologies that happen when any one of these get like way out of balance with the other one. So that to me is as much about the practice of any one of these is one thing, but it's like really about that balance and the interaction and the interfaces between them. They're critical to the outcome. So these are not technical problems. The problem isn't really people either. The problem is socio-technical. And I made that comment very, very early, but you have to solve both of them together to get these outcomes. So I'm going to say the best outcomes arise from excellence and alignment. So you need to get better at the skills, but you also need to get more aligned with each other. And the best methodology is inspired people working together. So my advice is be inspired and work together. And then I'll leave you with a quote from a very famous person: "I don't have time to learn new things because I'm too busy getting things done." Hopefully you don't work with this person, because this is the least productive person in the world. So like I said, I have a very privileged position to see a bunch of the practices and projects and the evolution of people delivering these outcomes. And I'm very thankful for what I get the opportunity to do. And hopefully this was interesting for you and meaningful. There's like a bunch of books we could recommend along each of those capabilities. The Team Topologies book is really great and practical for thinking about how to kind of like build and manage some of these platform things. And again, like we're going to have an open QA conversation right after this. So with that, I'll thank you. I'm not here to answer questions. I'm here to have conversations. So thanks again for your time if you made it this far.